你好, Fong Ling Ling. So here's the word help video I'm just making this evening, 15th of December 2014. And just to start off with, I thought that I'd list the words that we're due to go through today. So just to read them out before we start, have specify, special, specific, speciality, adapt, adjust, adopt, proceed, progress, proceed, resume, assume, presume, absorb, digest, assimilate, transform, transmit, transfer, transaction, accord, consistent, comply, accessible, available, obtainable, achievable, estimate, appraise, evaluate, plunge, decrease, decline, incline, slump, prone, hostile, opponent, cooperation, incorporate, corporation, minister, ministry, administration, log, logic, logicality, diverge, diversity, divergence, form, formal, formulate, profound, profundity, solid, solidarity, consolidation, coalition, solidify, ideal, ideally, idealist, idealism, external, internal, technology, mechanic, technique, arbitration, articulate, peculate, speculate, distinct, distinctive, distinguished, distinguishable, compress, minimum, condense, memorize, splash, grind, split, acquaint, acquaintance, contend, brood, crowd, herds, packs, flocks, autonomous, homogeneous, hegemonic, contrast, analogy, metaphor, image, impose, insert, plunge, pitch, emerge, emergency, and urgency. Okay, so those are all the words that we're due to go through in this video. And the way that I've organized it is to assign three names. So A is Alan, B is Brian, and C is Craig. I've just given them three pretty regular names, and what I've done is I've tried to make a little conversation involving the words that you wanted to talk about, and then try to explain the definition afterwards. Okay, so let's get started. So our first set of words are specify, special, specific, and speciality. So just to run through the conversation I've got Alan saying, I'm a very good chef. What is your speciality? Food. Well, that's not very specific. Can you specify which food? Certainly, my speciality is chicken. What makes your chicken so special? The spices I use are different to anybody else's. So, what this conversation is trying to symbolize is the difference between these four words. So first of all, we have specify. So this means from a group of things. So in our example, food. Tell me exactly what you mean. So maybe somebody has been quite general about something, you're not sure exactly what they mean, then you can ask them to specify what it is, what type it is. So chicken is a type of food, you're just specifying that. Special, what makes that thing that you mentioned different or more valuable than the other types of food, or in this example, types of chicken that people make. And what he tells us is that the spices are different, so that's what makes it special. Specific, very similar to exact, can also be used in a question. So, can you be more specific about what you mean? So what Brian says is, well, that's not very specific. He's saying, well, that's not very exact. When Alan says that his speciality is food, it's quite broad. We don't know what kind of food. And then finally speciality, which is just something that you're very good at doing or making. Okay, so the second group of words, we have adapt, adjust, and adopt. Alan says, I think we should adopt a new strategy. Brian says, why, when we can just adapt our current one? And we can't just adjust our current strategy, we need a new one. Second conversation is to illustrate a special case for using adopt. Alan says, I'd like to adopt a child. Brian says, that's a big decision to make. You'll have to adjust your lifestyle significantly. So when we say adapt, we mean to change something that's currently in place, usually to make it better. So this is what Brian means when he says, can't we just adapt our current one, our current strategy, the strategy that we're using at the moment. The reason why he says this is because he doesn't want to adopt a new strategy, and this is what we mean by adopt. It means take on something new, take on a new idea, a new strategy, or something like that. And the reason for the second conversation is to illustrate a special case about adopting a child. So Alan says, I'd like to adopt a child. That means that he wants to become a child's foster parent. He might go to an orphanage and decide to take on a child who isn't in contact with their parents, who needs some foster parents. And then finally we have adjust, which is to change something that's currently in place, but only by a small amount. So it can also be used in more day-to-day situations. Adapt will mostly be used for ideas or strategies, not for real life things. So if I'm talking about moving a table, I wouldn't say I'm adapting the position of the table. I'd say that I'm adjusting the position of the table. So that's the difference between adapt and adjust. Adjust is just used a bit more broadly in a wider range of scenarios. So the third set of words, we have proceed, progress, and proceed. So here's our conversation. Okay, now that the loud people have left the library, we can proceed with our work. Yes, while they were here, we made very little progress. Just because we proceed does not mean that we will make progress. Sorry, it doesn't mean that we will progress. Brian says, proceed is just to start doing something. Progress means moving forward with it. Okay, isn't it true that the adapt, adjust, adopt slide preceded this one? It is true, but other slides also preceded this one. So just the easier one first. Precede just means to come before the thing that you're talking about. So the last slide that we had was about that set of words, adapt, adjust, and adopt. So it was before this slide, but Brian makes a good point that when you talk about proceed, it doesn't just mean the one thing, the thing that's come immediately before the slide that you're talking about in this example, in this presentation. What he means is that anything that's come before this slide could be said to have preceded this slide. So proceed just means to come before the thing which you're talking about. Proceed is to continue doing something normally after stopping. So think of a car journey. You stop at, say, a red light, and then when it turns green again, then you can proceed with your journey. progress means to move towards your target, towards your goal. So if we think again about the car journey, you might proceed with your car journey, but if you're driving the wrong way, then of course you're not making any progress. You're actually going backwards. You're making backwards progress. You're moving further away from your goal if you're driving in the wrong direction. So that's the difference. Progress means moving towards your goal. Proceeding doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make progress. So the next set of words we have resume, assume, and presume. So we have two conversations again, just to illustrate a slight difference. So the first conversation: shall we resume our work now that the loud people have left the library? Brian says, you assume that they won't come back, otherwise. That means just that they won't return to the library. And Alan says, no, I presume it, because they said they have to go to class. And the second conversation is Alan saying, here is my resume. And the first thing to notice is the difference in pronunciation between the first conversation, where it was shall we resume, and the second conversation where it's here is my resume. Brian says 谢谢你, and Alan doesn't really know what to say because he doesn't really speak any Chinese. So the first word, resume or resume. Resume just means to continue with. It's a synonym of proceed, but it's a bit less formal. And what I mean by that is that in most situations you can use either proceed or resume, it doesn't matter. But resume is more common and it's less formal. And this is how we use this word in the first conversation. In the first conversation, shall we resume our work? This is what we mean, to continue with the work. However, in the second conversation, here is my resume, Alan says, he's actually talking about the second meaning of resume, which is a CV or job application. I think it's a French word. And the other two words, we have assume, which means to think something will happen with no evidence. So it's just maybe based on past experience, or maybe not even that much. For example, if you see the same person going to get coffee at 10 o'clock in the morning every day, then you might assume one day when you're sat at 9:45, you might assume that they will be going to get coffee that day at 10 o'clock again, because you've seen them go and get coffee at 10 o'clock before. But there's no evidence for it, it's just based on your past experience. Presume is a bit different. It means to think something will happen with some evidence behind it. So to just look at the first conversation, we have a situation where Brian says, well, you're assuming that they won't come back, because Brian doesn't think that there's any evidence that's backing up why Alan doesn't think that the loud people will return to the library. But Alan corrects him. He says, no, I presume it, because they said that they have to go to class. So the evidence is that they said that they have to go to class, therefore Alan doesn't think that they will be coming back to the library anytime soon. So, next set, absorb, digest, and assimilate. So, just one conversation this time. Alan says Craig moved to the UK 10 years ago from Australia. He has fully assimilated into our culture. Brian replies, "That's great. I travelled to Singapore recently to absorb some of the culture." Alan says, "I read a book about Singapore. I like to digest new information." Craig says, "I was reading a news digest that said Singaporean people speak both English and Chinese." And Alan and Brian both say that we know about that already. So absorb means think of a sponge. It means to be immersed in and soak up. So when Brian says that he visited Singapore, he was able to absorb some of the culture because he visited there, and for maybe a week or two, however long Brian travelled to Singapore, he absorbed the culture. He went there and just experienced it a little bit, so he learned something about it. Digest means to think carefully about and understand. Otherwise used for food, when your body breaks it down into smaller parts, that's also called digestion. So those are the two main uses of digest. You have it either with food, breaking down the food into smaller parts, or digesting information, which just it's almost a metaphor, which we'll go over later. We'll be talking about a metaphor later in the video, but digest really just means to think carefully about and understand. So in this situation, Alan says that he's read a book, so he's digesting some new information about it. And finally, assimilate, to become a part of or become one with. So Alan tells us that Craig moved to the UK 10 years ago, and that's quite a long time. So he has fully assimilated into our culture. That means that he's become one with our culture. He's been in the UK for so long that he does everything like a British person would, and he's learned everything there is to know about the way that British people do things. So that's what that means. I hope that is clear enough for you. Okay, transform, transmit, transfer, and transaction, the next 4 words that we're looking at. Alan says, "I need to transfer some money so that I can spend my money in a shop." Brian says, "Spending money is a transaction." And Alan says, "And how about if I sell something to somebody else?" And Brian says, "Ditto," which I'll explain in a second. Alan says, "I want to transform myself. I'll help people in poor countries." And Brian says, "You need to get some vaccinations first, so that you don't transmit a disease." So let me just explain a few small things about this conversation. So the first thing is you have a ditto. That's really just a small phrase meaning exactly the same as before, the same as what I said before. So Brian is saying that he already told Alan that spending money is a transaction, and so even if Alan is the person selling something to somebody else, it's still a transaction. So anyway, in the second conversation we also have vaccination, which you might know what that is, but just in case you don't, it's where the doctor will use a needle to just insert a very small amount of a disease into you, which will then your body will fight it, and because the disease is very small, it should be able to defeat it, and then you will be immune to that disease. So when you go and travel to an unfamiliar country, this is one of the first things that you need to check, is whether you need to protect yourself against any diseases there. So just to talk about the words in turn, we have transform, which means to change by a large amount, normally for the better. So when Alan says, I want to transform myself, he means I want to become a better person by helping these people in the poor countries. Transmit means to move from one place to another. And common usage is for disease. Normally people talk about transmitting a disease, which just means that maybe one person has a disease and you get it from them, then you say that you've transmitted the disease. So I don't think transmit is so common outside of that usage. We then have transfer, which is again to move from one place to another, but the common usage is for money. If somebody goes into a bank and says, I need to make a transfer, then that just means that they need to move some money from one place to another. Maybe they need to make a payment to somebody, or they need to move. If they have more than one bank account, it might mean that they want to move money from one bank account into another. But transfer is also used in other situations. So think of somebody moving house. They might say that I need to transfer my belongings from my from my old house to my new house. So transfer is also used in a wider range of everyday scenarios. And then finally we have transaction. Normal usage is for transfer of money from one person to another. Just a quick note, you won't use transfer in a business situation. What I mean is that when Brian tells us that spending money is a transaction, he's exactly right. When you spend money in a shop, you wouldn't call that a transfer, you'd call that a transaction. Transfer is only to do with when you talk about transferring money, it only really means transferring from one bank account to another. It isn't about changing money in a shop or something like that. So the next set of words, we have accord, consistent, and comply. Alan says, I think Craig is quite a consistent runner. And Brian replies, yes, but we have to make sure we comply with all the regulations for the competition so that he can compete. Alan says, we'll have to accord to them because of the officials. They will disqualify us otherwise. And Craig is just running at this point. So let me just explain what's going on in this conversation. So consistent means to be similar to, or to be of a similar quality every time. So when Alan says that I think Craig is quite a consistent runner, what he means is that Craig is of a similar quality every time he goes running. You know, if he is a good runner, it means that he is good every time that he goes to run. If he's bad, then it can also mean that he's bad every time. He's a bad runner every time that he runs. Although, in common usage, if you say that somebody is a consistent runner, you normally mean that they are consistently good, that they are good every time that they go out and run. So Brian says, have to make sure that we comply with all the regulations for the competition. So comply just means to abide by rules, just to follow the rules, to submit to. So yeah, it just means that you stick to the rules, that you're you're making sure that you follow them, and Brian makes the point that they have to follow all of the regulations, which you could replace that word with rules. We have to follow all of the rules for the competition, for the running competition, so that Craig can compete. And finally, the last word that we need to go over is accord, to give or grant something status, or to abide by or be consistent with. So I don't think that this is a very common word, but that's the meaning of it. And Alan says we'll have to accord to them. What he means by we'll have to accord to them is that we'll have to accord to the rules, the regulations of the competition, because of the officials, because of the people who are organising the event, and they will disqualify us otherwise. So they won't let Craig run if they don't follow all of the rules of the competition. Okay, next slide. We have accessible, available, obtainable, and achievable. So Alan asks, is my money accessible? Brian says yes, it is obtainable. Alan asks him, I'd like to transfer £1,000. Is that available? So just notice that we're still using transfer in this example because we're talking about a bank account. And Brian tells him that you have only £999 and 99 pence in your bank account. I'm afraid that it is not. So you can see that Brian has told Alan that he does not have £1,000 in his bank account, and therefore the £1,000 that Alan wants to transfer is not available. Alan says, do you think that one day I will have enough to withdraw £1,000? and Brian is supportive of him. He says that because you need only one more penny, I think it is achievable. I'm not aiming to make these conversations always realistic. I don't think that you'd normally have this conversation with your bank manager, but I hope that it illustrates the words to some degree. So accessible, something used for sometimes used for buildings, just means able to access, go inside. So it just means that so when Alan asks, is my money accessible, all he really means is am I able to get to it? Am I able to get some money out or transfer it or something like that? And available, next word, free from engagements. So think of meeting people. So if you ask your friend, are you available this Friday? What you're asking them is, do you have any plans for Friday? Do you have any other things going on, or are you free to meet up? And the same applies here. Alan is asking whether he has £1,000 free inside his bank account, whether he has £1,000 just resting there that he can access and take out of the bank account or move somewhere else. Obtainable, used mostly for objects. It means able to get hold of. So when Brian says yes, the money, it is obtainable, meaning that Alan's able to obtain his money. Brian means that Alan is able to take out some money from his bank account and get hold of it. He's able to get it. And finally, achievable. It's mostly used for some goal or target that you have for yourself, and it also means able to get, able to achieve, as it were. So in this situation, Alan asks him whether he thinks that in the future, do you think that one day, meaning in the future, do you think that in the future I will have enough money in my bank account to withdraw £1,000? And because Alan only needs one more penny in his bank account to be able to withdraw £1,000, it seems quite likely that one day, in the future, Alan may have £1,000 in his bank account that he can withdraw. Then it will be achievable. So just notice that the difference between him saying that the £1,000 is obtainable, meaning the actual money, and that's different to having the goal of having £1,000. So Alan wants to have £1,000 in his bank account. It's a goal. It's a target for him. So, and it's in the future. So that's really the distinction there. Okay. This one I think is a bit easier. So we have estimate, appraise, and evaluate. So Alan asks Brian. He says, I'd like you to evaluate how your work has been going this semester." Brian says, "I can make an estimate, but I cannot be independent about judging my own performance." And Alan says, "I understand. I can write an appraisal for you. I want you to think about ways in which you could improve." So we have estimate, means to make a guess. With the help of some evidence, you're not just making a guess. You do have some evidence. What Brian means by what he says here is that he can't judge his own performance because he is biased. He wants to give himself a good report, so he can't really see clearly where his faults are. So it isn't. He can only make a guess about how his performance has been, how his work has been going this semester. He can only make a guess at that because he is biased. We have appraise, which means to measure the success of, measure the value or quality of. So when Alan says that I can write an appraisal for you, just means that he can write a report that will just measure how successful Brian has been. And evaluate means to decide the value of something by thinking about the positives and negatives of it, and then you come to a final decision. Okay, so quite a lot of words on this slide. Plunge, decrease, decline, incline, slump, and prone. I think that unlike the previous sets of words that we've looked at, some of these words aren't too similar, but we can use them together. So the stock market has plunged today, Alan tells us. Brian says the prices have had a sharp decline. The decrease has been drastic. Maybe they will recover tomorrow. And Alan helpfully tells us that that would be an incline in the, and he means an incline in the prices of the stock. And then the second conversation, we have just a short one. Alan says, "Don't slump in your chair." And Brian says, "Well, it's better than being prone." Alan says, "You're prone to making trouble." He's telling him off. So, just to talk about each of these in turn. First of all, you have plunge, which means to go down very quickly. So if you are in a boat and you go over a waterfall, then you're going to plunge very quickly. You're going to go down very quickly. And it normally means something that just go down very quickly. So when Alan tells us that the stock market has plunged today, he means that the prices have gone down very quickly. Decrease means to be reduced. So this is used in a wide range of scenarios. I think it's a very common word, just to be reduced to, so it's more common than plunge and decline. But anyway, decline, means to slope downwards. So think of the line that the stock market makes. When you look at the graph, this might be a bit hard to explain unless you know what the stock market is, but I'm sure that you can look it up. It's just people can buy a share of a company, and the value of the company goes up and down all the time, depending on what its performance is like. And the change in the value of the company is recorded on a graph with a line. So just think of the line that the stock market makes when Brian tells us that the prices have had a sharp decline. All he means really is that the line has gone down, has sloped downwards quite quickly. And then we have incline, to slope upwards. So it's almost the opposite of a decline. Another way you can think about this is in terms of things like roads. A road can go down a hill. If you're driving down a hill, then the road is declining, and if you're driving up a hill, then it's inclining. And the last two words we have slump, means to slouch or dip. So just a little sort of dip, little drop in something, normally before it rises up again. So in the example, it means to not be sat up straight. Maybe he's not. When Alan tells him don't slump in your chair, he means don't slouch, don't sit up straight in your chair. And prone, well, I've used both of the I've used both forms of prone in this conversation. We've got to be lay on the ground on your stomach, so sort of lying on the ground on your stomach, or the more common way of using it is to be more likely to suffer from something. So, or to be more like, it's more broad than that. I mean, it really means to be more likely to do something. So when Brian says in the second conversation, well, it is better than being prone, what he means is that slumping in my chair is less rude than lying on the ground on my stomach. Alan then uses the second usage and more common usage of prone, which is you're prone to making trouble. He says that you're, from history, you're more likely to make trouble for us. So he's being rather rude. Okay, so a bit of a shorter slide this time. We got hostile and opponent. So Alan says Craig has been hostile to us recently. Brian says, I think it's because we don't involve him in our conversations. You'll notice that we haven't seen Craig for a long time in the conversations. I'm trying to get him involved, but it's difficult because normally I found with these slides I could make it a conversation with just two people. But I'll try to involve Craig a bit later on. So we have Alan saying, is he our opponent? He's asking a question. Is he our opponent? And This is not really. It's not a competition. So hostile just means to be angry with. So for example, you are being hostile to me. You're being quite angry with me, and it looks like you might want to fight me or something like that. Opponent means somebody who you are competing against. So notice that an opponent is always hostile to you. They're always acting against you. But someone who is hostile is not necessarily your opponent. So for opponent, I think it's helpful to think of a sport or boxing competition. If you're competing in a sport, then the other people who you are, say a running race, the other people that you're racing against are your opponents, and that's the difference between those two. Okay, so we have cooperation, incorporate, and cooperation. And Alan says, I think we can cooperate to incorporate this new idea into our corporation. And Brian isn't too happy because in this conversation I was able to get all 3 words into the first sentence. So Brian isn't very happy. He said, you used all 3 of the words already. So Brian doesn't have anything to say in this conversation. So let's just make the distinction between these 3 words. Have a cooperation, which means working together on something, being compliant with, for example, the law. So when the police want to speak with somebody, they might ask them, are you going to cooperate? What they mean is, are you going to try and run away from us, or are you going to be compliant with us? Are you going to talk to us about the thing which we want to speak with you about? But I think common usage is working together on something. So Alan's saying that him and Brian can cooperate together, can work together on something. Incorporate, to take in something as part of a whole. Okay, that I think is the common usage. That's the more common way of using this word, to take in something as part of a whole. So when Alan says, I think we can cooperate to incorporate this idea into our corporation, and a corporation is just a large business or enterprise, all Alan is really saying is, I think that we can work together to to use this idea, this new idea, in our business, in our large business or enterprise. So the business, the large business, the corporation will have many ideas. It will have a set of ideas that it uses to run its business, and incorporate just means they have this new idea and they want to take in this new idea and put it into that set of ideas that they already have. And I'll just mention briefly the less common usage of incorporate, which is a legal term. to start a new business. So if you want to start a new business, if you say I need to incorporate my business, then that just means that it's a legal term, meaning to you need to do some official things to start the business and make it legal. Okay, so 3 more words. We have minister, ministry, and administration. So Alan asks, did you know that Craig used to be a minister? Brian says no. Was he a government minister or a priest? Alan says a government minister. He was the head of the Ministry of Defence. Brian says that must have required a lot of administration. So, minister means either a leading government official or a senior Christian priest. So, think of, for example, the Prime Minister in the UK. He is the most senior. He is the most senior government official. I think that this is quite a common word in the UK to refer to heads of department in the government as well. So we have a ministry, which is a government department. For example, in the conversation that I've written, we have the Ministry of Defence, otherwise called the MOD in the UK. And I say a ministry is so called because it is headed by a minister. All I mean by that is that a ministry is called a ministry because the head of the ministry is a minister. And then finally we have administration. So the process of running a business or organisation, the management of government. So this is just the day-to-day tasks, the filing of papers, the writing of documents, sending of emails. These are all things which are administration, and it's just the day-to-day running of the business or department, organisation, or something like that. Okay, so we have log, logic, and logicality. This is a rather long conversation. We got Alan saying, I made a log this weekend. Brian says, oh, I never knew you were a lumberjack. Alan says, not that kind of log. I mean a written log. So, Brian says, isn't it strange that you write a log on paper and the paper is made of a log? I'll explain that joke in a second. I'm not sure. It's just a bit of fun. But it's just a playing with the words a little bit. Alan replies, it's just logic. The paper is made from wood. Brian says, maybe the English language has a certain logicality. So we have log, which can mean a piece of wood from a tree, or a record of events, a record of things which have happened. So Alan says, I made a log this weekend. What he means is that I made a record of events this weekend. But Brian misunderstands him. He said, oh, I never knew that you were a lumberjack. A lumberjack is somebody who cuts trees for a living as their job. They cut trees. So he thought that Alan had been cutting trees this weekend, and so had made a log by cutting the tree into pieces. And then we have logic, which just rules that determine whether something makes sense. It's just whether something makes sense or not, whether something is understandable or not, whether something when you think about it, does it really make sense? So when Alan says it's just logic, all he means is that it's obvious. If you just think about it, then it's kind of obvious. It just makes sense. And logicality. I'm not ashamed to admit that I had to look up what this word actually means, because I wasn't too sure myself. It's a very uncommon word, and I'd never heard it before. But when I looked it up, it just means that something that is logical. In other words, something that makes sense, something that is obvious by just thinking about it. So I will try to explain my joke a little bit. Brian says, isn't it strange that you write a log on paper, and the paper is made of a log? So let me just rephrase this a little bit, and maybe it will make some sense to you. Brian is saying, isn't it strange that you write a record of events on paper, and we call that a log, and the paper that's the log, that's the record of events is written on, is made of wood, is made of something else which we call a log. So you make paper from wood, and you write the record of events or log on the paper, on the log almost. Anyway, it's not important if you don't understand the wordplay, but I hope that at the very least you understand the three words in this slide. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. The next one, we have three new words: diverge, diversity, and divergence. So here's our conversation. Have Alan, I feel this road is about to diverge from where we want to go. Brian says, yes, there is a certain divergence taking place now. And Alan says, where is the road taking us? Where is this road taking us, sorry? Brian says, Beijing. Alan says, oh good. There are so many international people there, the diversity is interesting. So diverge just means to separate from and go in a different direction, move away from. So when Alan says that I feel this road is about to diverge from where we want to go, he means that it's it's moving away from where we want to go. So maybe they want to go to Shanghai, and the road is beginning to turn towards Beijing instead. So the road is beginning to diverge where they want to go. It's beginning to move away from where they want to go. Diversity means having great variety, so a large selection of different things. So Alan says that there are many international people in Beijing, so there is a lot of diversity in the people who live in Beijing, because they have a lot of different nationalities and backgrounds. And then you have divergence, which is just a process of diverging. So divergence is just what takes place as something is diverging. I think divergence is more of a tense or different form of diverge. It doesn't mean anything different by itself, and it's mostly about grammar. The grammar will determine whether you use diverge or divergence. So next one, we have form, formal, and formulate. I hope that this video is not too long, because we do have quite some time to go. So I hope that you're not bored yet. I will make a document that I can send to you, just listing the time for each of these slides, because of course if you want to come back to it, I'm sure that you don't want to have to go through all of the slides again. They're quite long. So anyway, to continue with the explanation, we have Alan saying, "I like your form." Brian says, "Well, thank you. I had to make the process to apply to be a member at the gym more formal." And Alan says, "Well, thank goodness you stopped short of making us wear formal clothes. I think you misunderstood me. I mean, I like your form, which you have when doing that exercise." And Brian says, "Oh, I see. Well, I can try to formulate a program so that you too can improve your form." This one I will spend some time on, because it isn't exactly easy. When we talk about form, we're talking about the shape or configuration of something, the way that it is arranged. So when Alan says, "I like your form," Brian at first misunderstands him, because another usage of form is a written document used for applications. So it can be a job, it can be a membership of a club, or in this situation a gym. It can be anything where you are applying for something. You're making an application, you're trying to join something. So Brian misunderstands him. He says, well, thank you. I had to make the process to apply to be a member of the gym more formal. So what he is saying is that he is the owner of the gym. He owns the gym. And he's talking about the process to apply to be a member. So he's saying that he had to he's talking about the way that you have to do things to become a member of the gym. So somebody has to apply to join the gym. He's just recently made the process what he calls more formal. And again, there are two different usages of formal. The first, which is what Brian uses here, is make something more official, or more structured. Make something more structured. It means that there's a more well-defined way, a more set way of doing something. So maybe before, the way that people became members at the gym which Brian owns was a bit chaotic. Maybe there was no real method to join the gym. It just kind of happened, and there was no process. So just recently, he has started using a form. He started using a written document used for applications. He started using that to make things better for people who want to join, make things more structured, make things what he calls more formal. I hope that that's understandable, but you can of course ask me about it afterwards if you don't understand that. Alan says, well, it's a little I threw in a few jokes into this presentation because it is quite long, so yeah, I thought it'd be fun to throw in a few jokes. Alan says, well, thank goodness you stopped short of making us wear formal clothes. And what he's saying is, well, it's good that you haven't made the process so that we have to wear formal clothes. And what he means by that is, when people say formal clothes, what they mean is things like a suit, a business suit for guys, or for girls, maybe quite an elegant dress or something like that. Just like what you would wear in a business environment, or for a very it's a very what you would wear at an expensive restaurant. That is what formal clothes are. Alan says, I think you misunderstood me. I mean, I like your form which you have when doing that exercise. So he's now talking about the first meaning of form, shape or configuration of something. So Brian is working out, and Alan thinks that Brian is doing the exercise quite well, quite effectively. So he likes he likes your form when doing the exercise, likes the way that you are arranged almost when doing the exercise. It just means that he thinks that Brian is good at doing that exercise. Brian says, oh, I see. And I can try and formulate a program so that you too can improve your form. And in the last sentence, he is of course using the first usage of form, shape or configuration of something. He's saying, I can help you to do this exercise better also, just like me. And formulate just means to create or prepare methodically. So he's going to create or prepare a program which Alan can follow to, get better at doing the exercise. Okay, so after that rather lengthy slide, this one is a bit shorter. We have profound and profundity. So Alan says the message was very profound, and Brian says yes, there was a great profundity in the message. These two, they are both saying the same thing, just the grammar is different, and so the word choice is different. Profound means great or intense, showing insight or knowledge. There's also a common usage for something which provokes great emotion. So, if something makes you feel quite strongly about something, then you can say that it has had a profound impact on you. And profundity is just, the extent to which something is profound. So it is how profound is something. That's what profundity is. So when Brian says, yes, there was a great profundity in the message, it just means that the message was very profound. It means the same thing as the first, as what Alan has said. I hope I haven't forgotten these names. I hope it is Alan and Brian, because it's been a long presentation. But anyway, I'm moving on to the next. We have 5 words on this slide: solid, solidarity, consolidation, a coalition, and solidify. As Alan says, I think support for our campaign is quite solid. So maybe they're campaigning for something. They're trying to get something done in government. Brian says yes, although to solidify it further we may have to formulate a coalition with our allies. So Brian is letting us know that there is more than one group of people who are campaigning for this thing to happen, whatever it is. And he is saying that to make their campaign better, to make support for the campaign more solid, to improve support for it, they need to think about working with the other groups that also support the campaign. Alan replies, there is a profound strength in having solidarity with our allies. So just note the use of profound here. We have what he means is that there is a great strength. There is a lot of strength in having solidarity with our allies. So Brian says one day there may even be consolidation of our 2 groups, I think. So now he's told us how many groups there are. There is the group that Alan and Brian are a member of, and then there is another group that also supports the same campaign. And Alan says there may be, but we must consolidate our position today, not think of what might happen tomorrow. So we have the words solid, firm or stable. Solidarity means unity or agreement among individuals or groups. We have consolidation, make something stronger or more solid, combine a number of things into one whole. We have coalition, temporary partnership between 2 or more groups, and solidify, to make something more solid. So just to mention this one then, so I think support for our campaign is quite solid, quite firm or stable. Yes, although to solidify it further, we may have to formulate, may have to produce. If we just go back a slide, sorry, 2 slides, may have to create or prepare a coalition with our allies, a temporary partnership between 2 or more groups, between, in this case, 2 groups. Brian has told us that there are 2 groups. Brian says one day there may even be consolidation of our 2 groups, and that means to, we see that consolidation, one usage of it is to combine a number of things into one whole. So they may cease to be 2 groups. They may just, the 2 groups may become one in the future, is what Brian is saying. And the hope is that, that would make it stronger or more solid. Alan says there may well be, but we must consolidate our position today. And he's then using the first usage of consolidation, which is to make something stronger or more solid. It is, I think that consolidation is more used, it has a more common usage than solidify. I think consolidation is stronger. Consolidation also has the idea of perhaps, cutting excess things. So, if somebody says that they want to consolidate a department in their business, it normally means that they want to make things more efficient. They want to maybe, bring 2 departments together, but they might cut some jobs, they might get rid of some staff, just to make things more efficient. So what Alan is saying is that we must make our position stronger today, we must make our campaign stronger today, not think about whether we might join with the other group tomorrow, or what he really means by that is in the future. Okay, so we have ideal, ideally, idealist, and idealism. So I've tried to keep the conversation here quite short, and I've thrown in a bonus word here which you can learn. So first we have Alan saying, ideally I would be an idealist, but really I am a pessimist. So I'll just repeat that one because I think it's a bit complicated. Ideally I would be an idealist, but really I am a pessimist. Brian replies, idealism is nice, but to think you can be an idealist all the time, is itself an ideal. And the second conversation, Alan says, my ideal life would be to live in the UK. Brian says, ideally I would too. And Alan says, we're both idealists. Idealism runs through our veins. So we have ideal, which just means an idea of what is perfect and most suitable. Ideally, which just means preferably, in a perfect world, what would you like to happen? Idealist is a person who makes decisions guided by their ideal world, guided by the sort of perfect world that they think about. And idealism means unrealistic belief in a perfect world. So, an idealist follows idealism. They really believe that their perfect world can exist, and they really believe in it, and so they make their decisions based on that to try and get to their perfect world. And the bonus word, just before we run through the conversation, is pessimist, which is a person who focuses on the negatives of life. So somebody who's very downbeat, somebody who really doesn't how's to describe it? They're just they're just very that is the best way to describe it. They are just very negative about everything. They don't see the opportunity in everything. They just see the risks or something like that. And that's the idea. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, let's get back on the presentation. Okay. So, okay, so yeah, to run through the conversation, Alan says, ideally, I would be an idealist. So, he's saying that in his perfect world, he would be the kind of person who would just would just make decisions based on, what he wants, rather than, thinking about things practically. So, if you think about, for example, applying for university, and getting a job afterwards, you might decide to go and study business, not because you're interested in business, but because you think that business will be better for you when you want to get a job afterwards. And that is not being an idealist. An idealist will be somebody who, let's just take another example. Let's say that they're very interested in ancient Chinese history, and they know that if they do ancient Chinese history at university, they're going to find it very difficult to get a job afterwards. An idealist will be the kind of person who does the subject which they are passionate about anyway, even if the job prospects are not as good as, say, business or another subject that they could take. So I hope that explains it. So Alan says, but really I'm a pessimist. So he's saying that, in my ideal world, I would make decisions as an idealist just purely on what I liked and disliked, but really, all I see is the negatives in everything. So I can't do that. Ryan says idealism is nice. So, believing in this perfect world is nice. It's a nice to have, but to think that you can be an idealist, to think that you can just follow your passions all the time, is itself an ideal. You can't always follow. What Brian's really saying, in simple words, is you can't always follow your passion. There comes a point where you have to you have to start thinking about things practically. You have to start thinking about whether something is a good idea because of the job, or because of something else, because of something outside of just, oh well, I'm very interested in that, so I should go and do it. I hope that makes sense. This one, external and internal. these two words are opposites, really. So Alan says, I think we need to hire an external person to do this job. Brian asks why. We have enough expertise among our internal employees. So external, being outside of something, coming from an outside source, or the outward features of something. So if I say that you have very beautiful eyes, then that is talking about something external. It's talking about your outward features, and what Alan and Brian are saying, or what Alan is saying, is that they need to hire somebody from outside their company to do this job. And Brian says that they have enough expertise among our internal employees. What he means, internal is just the opposite of external. It just means something inside. So, what Brian is saying is that the staff, the employees that they already have at the company can do the job. They don't need to get somebody from outside the company to do it. Okay, we have technology, mechanic, and technique. So they're discussing Craig. They're saying, Alan says, did you know that Craig used to be a mechanic? Brian says, really? That requires a lot of technique. Yes, there are specific techniques you have to use to use each piece of technology. Sorry, that's not very well written. I should have rephrased that, but it is what it is. And we see that Craig is still running. So just in case you were wondering where Craig was all of this time, I've managed to involve him in the conversation, but he's still running, I'm afraid. So, technology is machinery or equipment developed from scientific knowledge. So, just some basic examples of technology. Your phone, your mobile phone is technology. Your computer, the machines that they use in factories to make products, that's also technology. Anything like that is technology. So Alan says, there are specific techniques to use each piece of technology. So, as a mechanic, you will have certain machinery or technology that you have to use to do your job. And that's all he's really talking about there. Mechanic is a worker who repairs or maintains vehicles or other machinery. Vehicles, I don't know whether you know this word, but a vehicle is something like a car or a motorcycle. A vehicle is something with an engine, though. So, for example, a normal bicycle that's not a vehicle. A vehicle has to have an engine. So it could be a truck, a lorry, a train is really a vehicle too. So saying that Craig used to repair some machinery or some kind of vehicle. And then you have technique. You have a way of doing something in an effective way, or, which is, this is quite similar, skill or ability in a particular field. So you have a technique used twice in this example. So Brian says really that requires a lot of technique, so he's using it in the second way. That requires a lot of skill or ability. Being a mechanic requires a lot of skill or ability in a particular field. Like you have to have lots of skill or ability in doing something specific. Alan says yes, there are specific techniques. So what he's saying is that there is a way of doing something which is, when you are a mechanic, there is a way of doing things which is very effective, and you need to learn those ways to be a good mechanic. So I hope that makes things clear. Okay, next one. These are probably the fanciest words, I think, that we will be talking about today. We got arbitration, articulate, peculate, and speculate. Quite a short conversation, but I think that the explanation of the words may take a little longer. So we got Alan saying, we may need to undertake arbitration to settle this dispute. And Brian says, yes, we can only speculate on the right thing to do. An arbitrator can articulate things better. And Alan says, to think that Craig might have peculated the tax revenues when he was a minister is a disgrace. And okay, so you can tell by now that Alan and Brian perhaps aren't they perhaps don't get on with Craig too well. But in any case, the words. We have arbitration, the use of an arbitrator to settle a dispute, which then, of course, leads to the question, what is an arbitrator? So here is our bonus word for this slide. Arbitrator is an independent person or organization used to settle a dispute. If we were going to use the word from earlier, then you could say that it is an external person or organization used to settle a dispute. So, if, for example, you think that your company that you used to work for, a company that you used to work for, has fired you unjustly. They didn't have a good reason for getting rid of you. Then you may go to some sort of government body which is external of the company, which is independent of the company, which can look into it and can make a decision on the dispute that you're having with your old employer. Articulate means to express using the best words or having the ability to speak fluently. So when Brian says an arbitrator can articulate things better, what he means is that the arbitrator can speak more fluently about the dispute that Alan and Brian and Craig are having. Peculate, and I'm afraid that this is another word which I had to look up. I wasn't too sure what it meant. I'd never seen it before, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But peculate apparently means to embezzle or steal, especially public money. So what we have learnt is that Craig may have been stealing some of the money that people have given the government in tax when he was the minister for the Ministry of Defense that we heard about earlier. We then have speculate, to form an idea of something without strong evidence or experience. So this means that maybe you're not an expert in something, but you've heard something about it, or you've read an article about it, and you're just making a guess. You're having a little think about about something. So when Brian says yes, we can only speculate on the right thing to do, what he means is that because Alan and Brian are not arbitrators, they're not specialists, all they can do is they can only have a very rough idea about what is the right thing to do with their dispute. They need to call in the arbitrator to deal with their dispute in more detail. Okay. Distinct, distinctive, distinguished, and distinguishable. Okay, so the conversation goes like this. We have Alan saying Chinese people look quite distinct compared to Western people. Brian says normally they are distinguishable, apart from when a Western person also has Chinese ancestors. So for example, a British person, somebody who was born in Britain but whose parents maybe are Chinese. Alan says they are still somewhat distinguishable. Brian says true. In any case, the Chinese people are very distinguished. This conversation was a bit of a struggle to create, I must admit, and it's a very unreal conversation, but I think it serves the purpose. So just to go through these in order, we have distinct, different from something, of a similar type. Okay, so you might have a let's just take another example. We have a group of sheep, and all of the sheep are white apart from one sheep which is black. Then the black sheep is distinct from all of the others. You understand? It's different from something of a similar type. You can't really say distinct when you just have a load of different animals. It's really about things that are quite similar. You can have certain things that are that can be distinct because they are from a broader view. So for example, if you have your black sheep and it's in a field with 10 cows, then the black sheep is still distinct from the cows. But what I mean is that if in the field you have 3 dogs, 3 cats, 2 sheep, and the black sheep, then nothing is distinct in that field. I hope that clears things up. So what Alan's saying is that Chinese people look quite different to Western people, basically. And distinctive, noticeable in a good way. Okay. So, distinctive. I don't think I I don't think I got to use distinctive in the conversation, but it just means noticeable in a good way. So, if I say there's something quite distinctive about you, that just means there's something, there's something quite noticeable about you, which, in a good way. It's a compliment. I hope that makes sense. So it's something that's different about you from, you know, things of a similar type, but it's in a good way. We then have distinguished, which means honourable, demanding respect. So, you know, Brian is giving the Chinese people a compliment by saying that they're very distinguished, very honourable. Chinese people are very honourable and demand respect. Brian respects Chinese people, which is nice of him. So, we have then the last word, distinguishable, clearly recognizable as being different from something else. So this is broader than distinct, because the things don't have to be, you know, of a similar type. They don't have to be of a similar type. So, to just run through the conversation, we have normally, Brian saying normally they are distinguishable. Normally Chinese people are distinguishable, you know, are clearly recognizable as being different from Western people just by looking at them. Apart from when a Western person also has Chinese ancestors. And Alan says that they can still be somewhat distinguishable, so you know, even if you have a Chinese person who was born in the UK, you can still you can tell that they were born in the UK rather than being born in China. That's what he's saying there. So I hope that explains those 4 words quite well, but let me know if any further problems with them. Okay, so we have compress, minimum, condense, and memorize. I want to compress this material so that it takes up the minimum amount of space in my suitcase. Brian says the suitcase cannot get any more condensed. Alan says I have to memorize how I packed the suitcase. I need to put the things in the suitcase in a specific way so that it fits. So compress, we have squeeze or use pressure to flatten or make something smaller. So Alan has some kind of material that he wants to put into his suitcase, and he's struggling to fit it in, but he needs to squeeze or use pressure to flatten it so that it or make it smaller so that it takes up less space. Minimum, the lowest or smallest amount possible or required. So Alan is saying he wants this material to take up the lowest or smallest amount of space possible in his suitcase. Condense, make something denser or more compact, compressed. So what that means is that imagine you have a box and you have a certain amount of stuff in it. Now, if you put more stuff in the box, then you've made it denser. You've put more stuff in to the same box, okay? So you have a box, you threw some stuff in, there it is. You put some more stuff into the same box, it's now denser because you've got the same space, but you've got more stuff in there. I hope that that makes some sense. So now we have the so Brian says that the suitcase cannot get any more condensed. So he's saying that Alan has already made the best use of the space that he can everything in the suitcase. He's used all of the space in the suitcase that he can. He can't rearrange things to make things better. And Alan says, I have to memorize how I pack the suitcase. I need to put the things in the suitcase in a specific way so that it fits. Memorize is just to remember something, so when you tell somebody your name, you can tell them your name because you've memorized it, because you know what it is already. You don't have to go back to your book from primary school and keep looking at it every time you want to tell somebody your name. You've remembered it, you know it, and so you can just tell it to them. You can just say it to them. So what Alan is saying here is that he's going to have to remember how he arranged the things in his suitcase, because he needs to put them in the suitcase in a very particular way, in a very certain way, so that it all fits in, because if he puts one thing out of place, then he won't be able to fit all of his things in the suitcase after that. Okay, so we have 3 words here: splash, grind, and split. So here's the conversation. Alan says, I jumped into the swimming pool and the water splashed everywhere. Brian says, I see. Must have been fun. I was busy grinding some spices at home. I also had to split the meal into different parts to cook it. So, just to talk about each of these words. Splash. So, when I looked up the definition, it means causing liquid to strike or fall on something in irregular drops, which doesn't really explain so well what it is. I think the best way to explain it is with the swimming pool, where if you jump in the swimming pool, imagine what happens to the water. That is the water splashing. So I hope that the water splashes when you jump in the pool, and I hope that that is enough to explain what splash is, because I think it's quite hard to put into words exactly what it is. Grind means using pressure or friction to break something into smaller parts. So just sort of rubbing two things together to break them into smaller parts, or using pressure. So he's using some kind of tool, Brian is using some kind of tool to break the spices into smaller parts, maybe make them into a very fine material that he can put into the meal. And then finally we have split. Break apart into parts, normally along a seam or something. So I think the best way of thinking about this is in terms of opening food packaging. Imagine tearing open a packet. If you're tearing open a packet, you are splitting the packet. There is a part on the packet which makes it easier to open it, and if you are tearing along that opening, along the part where it is easier, then that is really splitting the packet. So when Brian says I had to split the meal, what he's saying is I had to create best to explain a different way. I had to break the meal into smaller parts. I had to maybe there's 3 people that he needs to serve. He needs to separate the meal into 3 different parts so that he can prepare it properly. Okay. So okay, and then the bonus word here, maybe you can try and pronounce it before I do. You can see it on the presentation, but I'll pronounce it now anyway. It's pronounced onomatopoeia, and I wouldn't worry about this word. It's I only learnt it when I was about 17, and it just means it just refers to when a word sounds like the thing that's described. So when I say splash, it sounds like what happens when water splashes on the ground. I hope that that makes sense. But if it doesn't, then don't worry about it too much. Okay. So we have 4 more words. We have acquaintance, contend, and brood. Alan says, I'd like to acquaint you with this new idea that I have thought up. So Alan's thought of a new idea, and look at what acquaint means. Acquaint just means make somebody familiar with. So he wants to make Brian familiar with this idea. Brian says, I've also been brooding on this problem for a while now, so you will have to contend with my idea. Brood, in this scenario, Brian is using the first meaning of brood, which is to think deeply about something that makes somebody unhappy. So the problem is making Brian unhappy, and he's been thinking about it deeply for a while now. But Brian has also thought up an idea, so Alan is going to have to contend with Brian's idea. And contend simply means to compete with, struggle to overcome. So, Brian would prefer to use his idea, but Alan has another idea. So Alan's going to have to try to compete with the idea that Brian has already had to resolve the problem. And Alan says, does Craig have any ideas? Brian says, Craig is only my acquaintance. I don't trust his ideas. Acquaintance means somebody who you know, but not very well. You might have met them once or twice, but you don't really know them very well. They're not your friend. You just kind of know them a little bit. Okay. So next set of words, we have crowd, herds, packs, and flocks. What I would say is that these are 4 words for a large group of something. So the conversation is a bit strange, but I hope that somewhat explains what it is. So Alan says there was a crowd of people gathered to watch the show, and Brian says yes, they flocked to the event like crows. And sorry, that is not actually a metaphor, that's an analogy. We'll be going over metaphor and analogy later, and I apologize for the mistake. That is, the note is actually what Brian has just said is an analogy, not a metaphor. Alan then replies, the children gathered like a pack of wolves. around the market stalls. Again, the children gathered like a pack of wolves. That is an analogy. Brian says they were herded into the event like elephants. So like elephants, again, analogy. Yes, there were so many of them. They had to pack them in tightly. Let's go through these in turn. We have first of all crowd, which is a large group, normally people. We have herd, which is a large group of animals of the same type, especially livestock. Livestock is they are animals which live on farms, usually, things like cows and sheep, things which people will eat. Pigs are also a livestock. We also have pack, which is a large group, usually animals with fur, like wolves or foxes or something like that, dogs. In this conversation, however, I am using the second usage of pack, which is to place something into a box or other container. So, when we were talking about condense and talking about placing things in our box, we could say that we were packing more things into the box, and that was making it denser, making it more condensed. In this scenario, in this example, Alan is saying that there were so many people. They had to place the people into the venue, the place where the event was taking place, the show was taking place. They had to pack them in tightly. They had to try hard to find space for all of the people in the show, because there were too many who wanted to watch it. And flock is normally a large group of birds, so that one is a bit easier. Okay, so these ones again are quite complicated, I think. So we have autonomous, homogeneous, and hegemonic, or hegemonic, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I say hegemonic. So this one is about Japan. Alan says Japan needs to become more autonomous from the United States. Brian says maybe. They are a very homogeneous nation. There are almost no foreign people there. No one says the native Japanese are hegemonic towards the gaijin. And first of all, let me start with the bonus word, which is gaijin, which you may or may not know, which is just the Japanese word for non-Japanese people. I understand it's a bit offensive, but I thought I'd put it in anyway, just for a bit of fun. And we then have autonomous, having freedom to govern itself. So Alan is of the opinion, and I'm not making any sort of statement here. I'm just, I only wrote the conversation about Japan because it was the first thing that came to mind. But what Alan says is that he thinks that Japan should have more freedom to govern itself, away from the United States. He thinks that the United States has too much influence over Japan. And we then have homogeneous. being all of the same kind. So when Brian says that Japan is a very homogeneous nation, what he means is that almost everybody who lives there is Japanese. There are very few foreign people there, so most of the people are Japanese. Most of the people are of one ethnicity. And finally we have hegemonic, which is ruling or dominant in a political or social context. So Alan is saying the native Japanese are very ruling, very dominant over the non-Japanese people in Japan. I also have a couple of bonus words, but I wouldn't worry about them too much if you don't recognize them, because the only reason why they're here is because the first time when you sent homogeneous to me, or what I assumed was homogeneous, you spelt it like this, which is, as far as I'm aware, pronounced the same way, pronounced homogeneous. It's an old-fashioned word for homologous. So here's our second bonus word, well, our third bonus word actually of this slide, homologous, meaning having the same relation or position. So I think that the example that I saw was, you could say that, an arm on a human is homologous to the flipper on a seal, or something like that. I wouldn't worry too much about these two words if you don't recognize them, but there they are. Okay, I think that we're approaching the end of the end of this video now. I hope that it's been helpful. We do still have a few more slides, but let me know how it's been, because it's my first time making a long video like this. I've never made something like this before, so let me know how you found it. So, 4 more words: contrast, analogy, metaphor, and image. So Alan asks Brian a question which I think you would probably ask me, and it's a difficult one. And Alan says, I'd like you to tell me the contrast between an analogy and a metaphor. And Brian says, let me give you an analogy between English and Chinese, by which he means the English and Chinese languages. He says that in English you have 26 puzzle pieces. They don't mean anything on their own, and you put them together in lots of different ways to make words. In Chinese you have lots of puzzle pieces. Most of them mean something by themselves, but you still put them together in lots of different ways to make other words. And Alan asks, and a metaphor? What is a metaphor? Brian says, in an analogy, you just imagine the characters are puzzle pieces. So, for example, one of the puzzle pieces that Brian is talking about might be shi in Chinese, or the letter B in English. Both of these would be puzzle pieces that Brian is talking about in his analogy. in a metaphor, they are puzzle pieces. So, if we remember going back a few slides, let me just see here. Where is it? Here it is. Okay. So, again, this is an analogy. So when I said that they flocked to the event like crows, like a pack of wolves, like elephants, the reason why that's an analogy is because you're not saying they are crows, or that they are wolves, they are elephants. You're saying that they are like wolves, like crows, like elephants. They resemble those animals, but they're not actually those animals. And so contrast means tell me the difference between, or differs substantially. So Alan's saying, tell me the difference between an analogy or a metaphor in his first sentence. An analogy is a comparison between one thing and another, which often uses images to make an idea easier to understand. So, Brian is using the idea of characters being like puzzle pieces, and you fitting them together in different ways to make words. He's using that image to try and make the Chinese language and the English language easier to understand. Metaphor means describing something as a different image for effect. So, for example, Alan's last sentence here, he says, so you have an image, like a crowd of children waiting to buy chocolate, like we had at the show earlier. If you want to, if you want to say it's a metaphor, in a metaphor, you say they are hungry wolves circling the vendor. You say they are hungry wolves circling the vendor. Now, we know that they're not hungry wolves, but you call them hungry wolves for effect, to show what they are like. In an analogy, you say they are like hungry wolves circling the vendor. They're just resembling hungry wolves. Okay, so a metaphor is a bit more extreme. And an image is a picture or other representation of something. So I think probably wraps those ones up, I think. Okay. So we have impose, insert, plunge, and pitch. These are the next 4 words. Alan says, I just want to pitch my idea to you. Brian says, no, you want to impose it on me. Alan says, we need more playing pitches. We can't plunge our schools into the sporting abyss by not having enough of them. Brian says, it is difficult to insert new playing pitches into schools that have already been built. So, let me try to explain a little bit about what's going on in this conversation. First of all, you have impose, to force an unwelcome decision or idea on something, or on somebody, sorry. So Brian's saying that Alan's trying to force, his idea onto him, and it's not welcome. Brian doesn't want Alan's idea. Insert, to place, fit, or push something. into something else. So Brian is saying that when a school has already been built, it's quite difficult to put a new playing pitch in, because there might not be any space for it from the original plan. And so, this is what insert means. Then you have plunge, to go down very quickly, as we spoke about earlier. And then I'll just go over the bonus word first. The bonus word abyss, a deep or seemingly bottomless chasm, okay, like a hole, something. So when Alan says we can't plunge our schools into the sporting abyss, he's saying that we can't completely destroy our school's sport by not having enough playing fields. He's saying that we can't throw the schools down this very deep hole by not having enough playing pitches. Okay, that's what he's saying. Okay, so I hope that analogy works. But again, you can ask me if there's any trouble with that. I think this one is a bit tougher to explain. And then finally we have pitch. Two different meanings. First one is to try to persuade somebody about your idea. So Alan says, I just want to pitch my idea to you. I just want to persuade you. Just want to try and persuade you about my idea. Or the second meaning of it is a playing field. Okay, somewhere where people play sport. Okay, so people talk about a football pitch or something like that, or a soccer pitch if you're talking about the American version. So Alan says we need more playing pitches. We need more fields, basically, where people can play sport. Okay, and I think I'm right in saying that this is the worst. Sorry, not the worst. Sorry, I'm tired. Warhandley. But this is the last slide, I believe. And the last three words, at least for this word help video, are emerge, emergency, and urgency. So first of all, we have Alan. An emergency is emerging. And then we have Brian saying, yes, this problem requires the utmost urgency. So we have emerge, to come into view, to become apparent. So something which is just, it means something which is just happening. You can just see it happening now. So then you have emergency, which is an unexpected or dangerous situation requiring immediate action. So when you call the ambulance or the police, then you call them because something is an emergency, because something is unexpected and dangerous, and you need them to come and deal with it as quickly as possible. You then have urgency, importance, that makes something require immediate action. So just to run through the short conversation, an emergency is emergent. He's saying that Alan is saying that this it's becoming apparent that, you know, a situation which we didn't expect a short time ago, which is dangerous and requires the police or an ambulance or something to be here, we can see it happening now. We can see it happening. So maybe, you know, you're in an office building and a fire has just started and it's getting out of control. Then it's clear that there will soon be an emergency. An emergency is emerging, and you need to call somebody to deal with it. Brian says, yes, this problem requires the utmost urgency. The importance that makes something require immediate action. So it just means that something requires immediate action. Okay. Now, the distinction between something which is urgent and something which is an emergency. If something is an emergency, what it means is that it is also urgent. An emergency is always urgent, but something that is urgent is not necessarily an emergency. And I've put in the comments here, think of a work situation. So, for example, your manager may say to you that this is urgent, this piece of work is urgent. It means that they want it done immediately. They want it done straight away. Now. They want it done now. But it's not an unexpected or dangerous thing. It's just a piece of work. It's not unexpected or dangerous. You don't need to call out the police. It's an urgent situation for you or for the company, but it's not an emergency. And that's the difference between those two words. Okay, so here's my little conclusion, just to wrap up this video. And we have a short conversation between Alan and Brian about their experiences. It's about 1:30 in the morning here, so I think it's fitting. So we have Alan says, 我很累. Brian responds, 我也很累. Alan says, 累, trying to correct him. Alan says, 不是, 我明年来中国. Alan says, 哇, 很棒. And then they both go to sleep, as I will be very shortly. And if you wondered what happened to Craig, then he was running for some time, but then he too fell asleep on the racecourse, and I'm sorry I didn't get him into the conversation a bit more. And I've added in a new person on this last slide, T. I guess that you can probably tell who that is. So, and T is saying 晚安, and that is of course me. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll send it across to you very shortly. And let me know about any comments that you have, and if you have any other words, then don't hesitate to ask me about them. Okay, speak to you soon. Bye bye.